Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Pereira. India and the United States will start a new 2x2 ministerial dialogue to enhance peace and stability across the Indo-Pacific region. The White House said this in an official release on Tuesday. This was decided after US President Donald Trump spoke with Prime Minister Narendra Modi on Monday to greet him on the eve of India's Independence Day. According to reports, the two ministers in the new 2x2 dialogue will be External Affairs Minister Sushma Swaraj and Defence Minister Arun Jaitley from India's end, and their US counterparts Rex Tillerson and James Mattis. However, no dates or the venue were announced for their first meeting. On this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyze the significance of the 2x2 ministerial dialogue. Joining me on the program today are KP Nair, Strategic Analyst, Kawal Sibbal, former Foreign Secretary, Bharat Karnad, Research Professor, National Security Studies Center for Policy Research, and Major General Retired P.K. Sehgal, Defense Expert. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Ambassador Sibbal, I'd like to begin with you. What do you think of this new initiative? How is it going to really help the two nations?
Well, I think the timing is important, and it's the White House that has taken the initiative to announce this. Though we have this 2+2 dialogue with one or two other countries, we have it with Japan, and I think we have it with Australia. But having it with America actually would mean that we intend both sides to coordinate our foreign and security policies. Now, in itself, there is a message in this announcement, especially as it has been linked to the Indo-Pacific region. But my concern would always be whether this dialogue, 2+2, will focus as much on the Asia-Pacific region as on what is happening on the western side of our country. But unless we have a real meeting of minds on Pakistan and its role and the China-Pakistan nexus, this dialogue would push us more in the direction of supporting U.S. policies and interests in the Asia-Pacific region or in the Western Pacific region, which would be useful, but more useful to the Americans than to us. So this is as yet not clear, and I'm not very sure in my mind whether we'll be able to manage American thinking and policy towards Pakistan and China and their nexus. Some things will become clear after they announce their revised policy on the Afghanistan region, whether that will give us some indication of where America wants to head in terms of its relationship with Pakistan. But going by past experience and other objective factors, I can't see the United States giving us the kind of support we need actually on the western side, but because China is not only actually China is a less of a problem to us in the Western Pacific. It is a far more a problem to us on the northern border, western side. So I think this point has to get distilled over time, and we'll see how useful this dialogue would be.
Indeed. Mr. Nair, what shape do you see this taking in the days to come? Of course, the details are very sketchy at this point in time. Nobody really knows what's likely to happen in the near future. But what shape do you foresee it taking in the near future?
You see, the Americans have been wanting to do this for a very long time. When the strategic dialogue was started, at one point they tried to inject the Pentagon into this. And I remember one time Robert Gates wanted to get involved, and A.K. Antony resisted it. And I know this from very confidential sources, that when the strategic dialogue was being held here, the Americans insisted that Robert Gates will come with Hillary Clinton, and Antony made it very clear that if Gates comes, he will go to a place where he cannot even be contacted on the mobile phone. That is Antony. Then the Americans were very disappointed. It was dropped. Then Gates wanted to come on a farewell call. Antony again ducked. See, because Ambassador Sibbal is very right. For the Americans, the defense relationship is fundamentally transactional. It is not getting into convergence with our security priorities or anything. So they want to get it mixed up with other things that are important to India. I mean, they have been going at it for a very long time. So there is no harm in having agreed to this and trying it out. But we have to be very, very cautious. We have to make sure that like we did during the nuclear deal, during the negotiations, how our interests can be made paramount in this, and make sure that the Americans don't get away with what they want in this.
Sure, fair enough. Professor Karnad, how do we safeguard our own interests?
Well, look, the problem really is that there's never been a dearth of instruments and all kinds of fora that we have between the United States at all levels. It's just that nothing gets transacted for the very simple reason that, for one thing, the Indian bureaucratic functioning is such that, for instance, no military-to-military links are allowed on their own. There's always the MEA and somebody else interjecting, and they are the ones who are trying to preside over the relations. They are the ones who decide how much gets and who goes where, etc. For instance, there is, we all know that there is this two-in, two-out kind of standard that is maintained for the military, which is that you can have 2 visits by the Americans and then 2 visits here by the Americans and 2 visits by Indians to Washington or whatever. It's a kind of metric that really defeats the entire purpose of building up a relationship. So it has spawned a lot of frustration at the American end, and also, may I say, at the Indian military end. But that said, because there is no larger vision driving, at least from the Indian end, no larger vision driving the interaction, the strategic relationship has stalled. And I don't think that the new 2-into-2, whatever the thing we are talking about, with Jaitley and Sushma Swaraj climbing on to the bandwagon, is going to help us. The other thing is precisely what the problem is. Our fixation in some sense with Pakistan defeats the larger strategic game, which is China. Now, are we or are we not going to deal with China? By ourselves we'll not be able to deal with it because China is just too big, too powerful. And yes, the US would like to drag us into their own little game in the Indo-Pacific or whatever it is. But then how much do we get tethered at our end with the concerns with Pakistan?
Sure.
The China-Pakistan nexus is a concern, but it is something that we need to begin to strategically assess in realistic terms. And that I don't think we have done to the extent where we know what practically is involved in real terms on the ground. So all these things are up in the air. Nothing is really, you can talk about 2-into-2 and this, that and the other. As I said, we have not had any dearth of these forums. It's just that nothing has really progressed very much.
Sure.
I doubt very much whether Mattis meeting with Arun Jaitley, the acting defense minister, or Tillerson with Sushma Swaraj is going to break through the bureaucratic logjam that is there, procedural logjam.
Okay, fair enough.
That is there.
Right. General Sehgal, I'd like to bring you into the picture now. Is it nothing other than symbolism then? I mean, isn't there anything significant about this announcement?
As per my perception, this announcement is absolutely and totally significant. I totally agree with Kapil by saying,
Mr. Kamal
that the timing is very, very important. Taking place on our Independence Day, that too on the initiative of the American side, we have come a long way. We are very confident of ourselves as to what we want and where we want to go. Gone are the days where the Americans could use us wholly solely to their advantage. Now we sharp enough, clever enough to ensure that we use the Americans to our advantage as much as they would like to do, use us for their advantage. We want a certain amount of space as far as the Indo or as far as the AFPAC region is concerned. We want to have a critical role in the Indian Ocean region as well as certain interest in the Asia Pacific region, because 50% of our trade comes from there, and guarding the sea lines of communication of ours is as critical as that of China and as that of America and elsewhere.
How serious are the Americans to better our goals as far as these regions are concerned?
That will be seen over a period of time.
Okay.
Initially, to come to the conclusion that they're going to use us, it's a win-win situation for them and not win-win situation for us. I think it will not be to our advantage if we go with that
mindset. Okay. Okay. Fair enough. You know, Ambassador Sibal, you spoke about how this is not something new. There are similar kind of agreements, arrangements, or whatever you want to call it, with other nations as well. What has been the success story thus far as these kind of agreements are concerned?
So those agreements are not very important because those countries don't play such a vital
But I think the Americans have a similar kind of an agreement with Japan.
Yes, they do. That's very important because Japan is their ally.
Yes.
And the Japan-China relationship is very fraught, and the United States can be pulled into a conflict. There is the North Korean issue which impinges on China, on US-Japan relationship. China-Japan relationship impinges on Japan or US responsibilities in the region, so they have to make sure that they remain on the same wavelength all the time. But in our case, such considerations are not there. Now, in the case of the United States, a couple of things I want to say. One is that we can have this 2+2, but the success of the 2+2 will also depend on much greater coordination between the Indian Defense Ministry and the Ministry of External Affairs. I mean, this has been said time and again, that there is a very insufficient coordination between these two ministries. And as was pointed out earlier in a different context, it's the bureaucracies who have actually to put their heads together and come on the same wavelength. At the political level, it cannot happen because they can't independently think of initiatives and policies unless it is buttressed by proper bureaucratic works. So the bureaucracies have to work together in order to make this 2+2 a success. Secondly, the US strategic goals and their policies are much clearer on the sea. We've been having these exercises, naval exercises with the Americans for a long time, and they have been growing.
Most recent one being the Malabar exercise.
Malabar exercise, Japan has got included. They have been growing in complexity. So we know the hand the Americans want to play, and there is advantage to us in this, and that's why after Mr. Antony, who was a little more reticent about these matters, we've opened up more. But the Americans haven't actually laid out what their strategy is with regard to the land frontier that India has and the challenges which we face from there. On the contrary, whatever signals we get are problematic for us, not only in terms of their relations with Pakistan and the Taliban and Afghanistan and China, Pakistan, even Iran. So if you're going to have a broad strategic in external affairs and the defense ministry on both sides, we have to necessarily build a consensus on the larger picture that confronts both countries. The United States can't say, give me a free hand to do what I want in the area west to us, because they have different interests and they are at times not in convergence with ours, but they want us to demonstrate our good faith that we believe in this strategic relationship by being closer to them in terms of the general policy in the Indo-Pacific. So there has to be a balance between these two things, and let's hope this balance will get created. Indeed.
You know, taking cue from what the ambassador just said, Mr. Nair, you know, can we count on the Americans really as far as our land border issues are concerned? You know, even as the Oklahoma issue is concerned, there have been several comments from American think tanks and others saying that India has acted very, very responsibly, but beyond that there hasn't really been anything.
I think we overestimate American concerns about our land border issues, as you put it. I think the American concerns are much larger. You know, they have a certain vision this region, and they have certain ideas about India. So I would not reduce it to excessive concern about the land border issues. But the general said that we have come a long way. I entirely agree. But we still haven't resolved the structural issues in Indo-US relations, you know. Mr. Sibal will be able to attest to it. He was DCM in Washington. From that time onwards till the time he was Foreign Secretary, he has very closely followed the relationship. And you know, we, unlike with so many other countries with which the United States has similar or deeper relations, I mean, our structure, the structure for our relationship with the US has gone through so many changes, you know. We had the strategic dialogue, then we created so many dialogues out of it. At one time, there were 35 different dialogues going on between India and the United States. When I was a correspondent in Washington, every week we had somebody coming from New Delhi, you know. And where does we have meetings and meetings and meetings which don't produce anything. And then Hillary came here when she was Secretary of State, and she must have been fed up of this, you know. So she did something. She codified the whole 35 dialogues into 5 key things that would guide the relationship, you know. And that has been going on. But obviously the administration wants to change the priorities because they obviously haven't worked to those expectations, you know. That is, I think that is why this 2+2 is now being proposed. But it's not to say that the relationship is not working well, you know. Fundamentally the relationship is doing well, and there is a lot of goodwill for the relationship, unlike for most of the countries which deal with the United States.
Sure.
But we need to structure the relationship better. But I'm not sure if the 2+2 dialogue is the
heading
answer.
in that direction. Fair enough. You know, Professor Karnad, there's a lot of talk about, you know, strategic partnership, strategic dialogue, and you know there was hope that India's ties with the United States would lead to a strategic partnership. Are we headed in that direction?
Well, look, I think I think we as a country and generally as a people, we like to have someone to lean on or lean, you know, just help us out. We tend to be the sort of entity that always requires assistance to get our own work done. And that's kind of the psychological, shall we say, dependency complex we have developed over the last 70 years. That someone else is going to take care of our security. If it's Russians yesterday, it's going to be the Americans tomorrow. I think we have to get out of this. It has been precisely our bane that our governments have thought in this way, that we require somebody else to look after our security, ensure our security, and so on. The fact of the matter is you'll gain far more respect everywhere, including in Washington, if you had a very clear vision, a strategy, a game plan to deal with what we consider our threats to be. The Americans will have their own notion of threats, the Japanese their own, and so on. The problem is that we haven't been very clear in terms of, because we still look to the Americans to say, well, what are you going to do for us vis-a-vis the land border? Well, what are they going to do for us? Nothing. That's not their priority. So let's at least become clear and prioritize our threats and what we mean to do with our capabilities, with our resources, rather than go on and on about what the Americans are going to do for us. You know, we have to stop you know, looking to somebody else for our own, to solve our own, you know, security problems. And I think this is what the real thrust of the matter is, that we should, you know, begin to work out our own solutions. And then we see how the Americans fit in, or some other partner, so-called strategic or whoever,
Sure.
can fit into our scheme of things.
Right.
Rather than seeing how we fit into someone else's plans.
Right. General Sehgal, is that the way forward? Is that the solution really as to how to deal with our problems are concerned? Come up with a solution first and then see how some of the major big powers in the world can fit into the scheme of things.
Some very interesting statements have been made. Firstly, as far as India's land borders are concerned, both western and northern borders, we do not need any assistance of any sort from America, other than we may need certain types of missiles and arsenal. Americans have gone on record about 15 days back by saying, should China play the mischief, they must not ignore the United States. They said they'll move their aircraft carrier and certain submarines in the Indian Ocean region. Also, they will make certain naval maneuvers in the Asia-Pacific region. Plus, they said they'll provide to India all the wherewithal it needs in terms of arsenal. Primarily, the statement is they are a nation which wants to make money. Their armament industry would be too happy to assist us in giving those goodies that we need. So that they made it very clear. Second statement that they made, that India's restraint or a strategic restraint is commendable. The way the Chinese have been using their media for domestic consumption, for international consumption, they've been calling the diplomats, briefing them every day. They've been blackmailing, arm twisting, carrying out psychic warfare. We've only been smiling without making any noises whatsoever. This indicates a huge amount of confidence on our side. Plus, we've improved our critical relationship with Vietnam and with Japan. With Japan, we have a 2+2 treaty, which is a little different from the 2x2 proposed. And that 2+2 treaty with Japan is actually working on the ground ever since dispensation came into being. As far as Vietnam is concerned, our relationship is very, very close today. And the Chinese are worried about that because we've decided to move our BrahMos as well as Prithvi missiles into Vietnam.
Sure.
Whereby in a matter of minutes, you have certain options which you never had earlier. And the Chinese are aware of those and they're worried about it. Chinese are also worried about your very, very strong stand.
So we are looking after our own interests is what you're suggesting. Yes. Okay.
Only thing which worries me, that if you really want to maximize the dividends that can accrue, we are not structured for that. Our Ministry of Defence is structured to fight the war of the 19th century. For the warfare of 21st century, that was some of the critical recommendations of the Kargil war. We haven't still gone into it. We still don't have the integrated theatre command. There's nothing on the integration and jointness within our armed forces.
And that is a worrying fact.
And that's a worrying fact. Now, how do you talk about integration between us and the Americans, or integration between us and the others, when there is no integration and jointness within your own?
Sure.
Even our bureaucracy is not conditioned for such adventurism.
Okay, fair enough. Ambassador Sibal, moving forward now, the Americans, do you believe, are worried about what the Chinese are doing as far as the Pacific is concerned, because the Chinese have made some forays into the Pacific of late as well since 2015, and is that why they're looking at this kind of a 2+2 partnership, a 2+2 dialogue, keeping in mind the Indo-Pacific region?
Well, a few comments I'd like to make. First of all, there's a lot of uncertainty about where America is headed, where Trump is headed. So we cannot be 100% confident that the initiatives that are being taken at this point in time will be sustained. Secondly, when our Prime Minister went there and the joint statement was signed, certainly there were elements in the joint statement which laid out convergence of interests in the Asia-Pacific region, but there was no reference to the joint strategic vision document on Asia-Pacific and Indian Ocean regions that was signed with Obama. So what importance should we give to this omission, I don't know. But in terms of a conceptual framework that had been devised earlier with Obama, that element was missing in this new relationship that the Trump administration wants to build with us. So things are up in the air. The third thing is that, the American foreign policy currently is being heavily dominated by the military. In fact, the State Department has lost a lot of its importance, and Rex Tillerson does not carry as much weight as previous secretaries of state have done. And there are too many generals around Trump. So we have to see whether in this 2+2 dialogue, whether the Pentagon will dominate it. And the Pentagon itself is divided internally between Central Command and the Asia-Pacific Command, and the Central Command is always leaning towards Pakistani interests, whereas the Asia Pacific Command leans towards Indian interests because it is far more sea-based than the Central Command. So these are certain contradictions in the American Pentagon setup, which would have a bearing on how much convergence we can build all around us in terms of
far
our
more complex
respective interests. And finally, why does America need alliances with so many countries and bases all over the world and NATO and everything else? If America can do things alone, let them do it alone. No country can look after its own interests alone. You have to build ties with certain key partners and extract the maximum out of them. And the approach that we decide what we want and others must fit into that just simply does not work. Does not work even in the case of the United States of America. They can't even handle today their NATO partners, the key NATO partners.
Right.
So it's a very, very complex exercise. There are no simple answers, but broadly speaking, I would say that this is a good initiative, and it should be sustained and it should be deepened because we need it at this point in time, with one small caveat, that the impression should not get around that the Indo-US, India and US are building a kind of an alliance against these China-Russia alliance, because China and Russia are coming very close.
Yeah.
We have to keep in mind the importance of our relationship with Russia, and to see how now we can develop our ties with the United States and maintain our lines open with Russia and not allow any mixed signals to go to the Russians that we are now driving ourselves too much in the American camp. And this will then raise further questions about BRICS and everything else.
Right.
But that's a different issue altogether.
Sure, indeed. It's so very well summed up by you, the entire issue, so I'm going to wrap the show on that because I'm completely out of time as well. It's a balancing act really as far as India is concerned, and that's what we need to keep in mind going forward. I'd like to thank all my guests, KP Nair, Kawal Sibbal, Bharat Karnad and PK Sehgal for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. That's all the time we have today. See you again next time.